He was so selfish that he let his son die in prison. So cruel that more than 20 million people died because of him. But at the same time, he was so cowardly that he fainted when he got the news of the enemy's attack. But still, he was called Iron Man, or Man of Steel, or Stalin. This was Joseph Stalin, the Iron Man of Soviet Russia. We were showing you the story of this dictator of Soviet Russia. Joseph Stalin, one of the most famous leaders of Soviet Russia, was not Russian, and neither Stalin was his real name. He was Georgian, and his name was Iosif Jugashvili. The word Stalin later became associated with his name. Stalin was born in a beautiful village called Gori on the banks of the most famous Mitkvari River in Georgia. The house you see on the screen is where Joseph Stalin was born. In the streets that are in front of you there, Stalin grew up. But now this village has become a beautiful city. The village was beautiful, but Stalin himself was not handsome. Scars of smallpox had robbed him of the beauty of his face and poverty of his comfort. His father was a cobbler. He used to drink alcohol and used to beat his son when he was drunk. Stalin's mother was cloth washer. She used to wash people's clothes and contribute to the household expenses. But she regretted that not only was her husband a drunkard, but her son was also useless. Instead, young Joseph used to beat up village boys or commit petty thefts. He formed a group of petty thieves, of which he himself was the leader, and his disciples called him Susu. The boys of this group used to take fruits and other food items from the shops and run away. When someone chased them, they would jump into the Mitkvari River and swim to the other side. Although Stalin's parents were poor, they wanted their son to become a priest and not a thief. So they enrolled the 14-year-old Stalin in a seminary in Tbilisi, the capital of Georgia, in what was called Tiflis in the 19th century. His parents believed that Stalin would stay away from the company of his friends in the strict discipline of the seminary and follow the path of religion to bring about the hereafter of his parents. But the harshness of the teachers could not crush the germs of rebellion in Stalin's heart. One day, he bought figs from a shop. The shopkeeper wrapped the figs in a paper and gave them to him. The paper was originally a propaganda pamphlet of the Communist Revolutionaries of Russia, written by communist leader Vladimir Lenin. Stalin read this pamphlet and kept it in his pocket. When he reached the hostel room, a strange situation awaited him. The police were searching his room. The police said that Stalin was involved in anti-revolutionary activities. Perhaps they had come to know about the pamphlet with Stalin, but they didn't know that pamphlet was still in Stalin's pocket. For some reason, they did not search it and found nothing in the room. So they left after some time of confusion. After his departure, Stalin burned this pamphlet, but his rebellious nature was affected by the things written against the government in the pamphlet. He knew that communists were influenced by the ideology of Karl Marx, so he also secretly started studying the books of Karl Marx. Marx's philosophy was against religious traditions, so when his teachers learned that Stalin read Karl Marx's books, they expelled him from the institution. After being expelled from the seminary, Stalin started doing odd jobs to make ends meet. In 1899, he also worked as a clerk in the observatory of Tiflis. But during this time, Stalin had established close relations with the communists. He had become a member of the Social Democratic Labor Party of Russia. But at heart, he was more influenced by a faction of the party called the Bolsheviks. This faction was led by Vladimir Lenin. The Bolsheviks faction believed in armed struggle to overthrow the government, that is, violence. And Stalin's rebellious nature also favored secret activities and violence, so both of them started to become compatible. Meanwhile, in 1901, Stalin launched a communist newspaper, People's Struggle, which was secretly published from a shop in Baku. Stalin's articles were published in this newspaper, due to which he became famous. He then went to Baku, and there in 1902, he led 3 successful strikes of factory workers. He became so famous with these strikes that his name started to be counted among the big leaders of the party. By 1903, he had formally become an active member of the Bolshevik faction. Seeing his fame, Lenin took him under his patronage. That is, Stalin was now considered the second greatest leader of the Bolsheviks after Lenin, and also Lenin's gifted disciple. But what Stalin did in the party was not political at all. Do you know what his biggest responsibility was? It was a responsibility to rob. Yes, he used to rob banks and deposit the looted money in the party fund. Hence it was named Kuba. In Georgian legends, Kuba was a Robin Hood-like hero who would loot the wealth of the rich and distribute the looted wealth to the poor. Therefore, the Soso of Gori village had now become the cradle of the communist revolution. But now he had to get a new name: Iron Man, Man of Steel, or Stalin. As it happened, during the 10 years from 1903 to 1913, Stalin was arrested 7 times, and several times he was exiled to Siberia as punishment. Large prisons were established in Siberia, where the most dangerous prisoners were kept and subjected to hard labor. But by 1913, every time Stalin was sent to labor camps in Siberia, he escaped and returned. People gave it a new name because of the harshness of Siberia. Steel is called Stal in Russian language. Accordingly, people began to call him Stalin, meaning Iron Man. So now his 3 nicknames were Soso, Koba, and Stalin. But in history, he is known as Stalin. By 1912, the Bolshevik fraction had separated from the Social Democrats and formed a separate party called the Communist Party of the Soviet Union. Lenin made Stalin a Central Committee member of the new party. But the next year in 1913, the Russian police arrested him again and sent him to Siberia. He was imprisoned for 4 years now. In 1917, when the Russian Revolution took place, Stalin again escaped from prison. In the same year, Soviet Party also took over the government. Stalin's power grew even more under the new regime, but his greatest success came 5 years later, in 1922. When Lenin created a post of General Secretary in the party, he gave this post to Stalin. A few months after Stalin became party General Secretary, Lenin was bedridden from a brain hemorrhage and died within 2 years. But before he died, he had strongly opposed Stalin's authoritarian style. He criticized Stalin in his secret writing and said that Stalin should be removed from the post of General Secretary. But the letter already fell into the hands of Stalin, and he did not allow it to reach the concerned people. After Lenin's death, there were now 2 candidates to succeed him. One was Stalin, and the other was Red Army Chief Leon Trotsky. But Trotsky did not have much support in the party's Central Committee. Stalin first expelled him from the party in 1926, and then expelled him from Soviet Russia in 1929. Even in 1940, a man in Mexico killed Trotsky with an icebreaker. After Trotsky was expelled from the party in 1926, Stalin had a complete grip on power. Now he emerged as a dangerous dictator. He announced to nationalize the agricultural land of Soviet Russia. The Russian government ordered large peasants to consolidate their lands into large agricultural farms. 90% of whatever is produced in these farms will be kept by the Russian government, and the remaining 10% will go to the farmers. It was a very cruel decision. It was also against the spirit of communism. Communism aims to benefit the peasants and workers more. But Stalin was determined to take away the lands of the peasants. Farmers revolted against the decision to nationalize the lands. They even burned their crops, killed their animals, and hid what crops they had in graves. But they refused to give all this to the government. Stalin was disturbed by this and declared war against the kulaks. On Stalin's order, the Red Russian Army killed 3 million peasants in their own country. Many peasants were sent to labor camps in Siberia and elsewhere. These camps were called gulag, and the lucky few who went there returned alive. After crushing the kulaks peasants, Stalin nationalized 99% of Soviet Russia's agricultural land. The government established large agricultural farms on this land. Now in Russia, on the one hand, this year due to lack of rains, crop production was already low, and famine was spreading in the country. While even in the government farms, the little crop that was produced was taken by the government, and this part would be given to the urban population or exported. Farmers had nothing left for food. The result was that between 1930 and 1933, 6 million people starved to death in just 3 to 4 years. The one who only stole fruits from the farmers in his childhood was now robbing all their crops and at gunpoint. He no longer needed to jump into the Mtkvari River to run away, but farmers were running away from him for their lives. In just 10 years, 170 million farmers left the villages and started working hard in the cities. But it was nothing but what was about to happen was even more dangerous. In 1934, Stalin ordered the killing of all his opponents in his party and army. Thus, 93 out of 139 members of the Central Committee of the Communist Party were killed. 81 out of 103 army generals, including admirals, were put to death. 1 million of the 3 million Communist Party workers were killed. The public also came to wrap up this massacre. 2 million people were sent to labor camps on suspicion of being anti-communism. Out of these 200 million, at least 100 million people could not return alive. One of the cruelties that Stalin inflicted on his people happened in Chechnya and Ingushetia. Both were Russian states, but resisted Russian occupation. On the 23rd of February 1944, on the orders of Stalin, the entire population of Chechnya and Ingushetia, whose total number was around 500,000, was arrested. The old and sick were shot at the same time, and the rest were exiled to various states in Central Asia. These people were allowed to return home after 13 years when Stalin was dead. But by then, not even half of those people had survived in exile. That is, Stalin is accused of being a direct or indirect killer of at least 200 million people, including farmers during Stalin's reign. The media was also completely banned within Soviet Russia. Nothing was published except the praise of the government. This policy is known as Iron Curtain, but Stalin was not alone in this cruelty. At that time, Stalin was not alone in the world in committing such atrocities. Another dictator who was even bigger than this was the German leader Adolf Hitler. Both Stalin and Hitler wanted control over Europe, and it was possible that the attempt would lead to war between Soviet Russia and Germany. But Stalin was afraid that if he started a war with Germany, the people fed up with him might overthrow him. Hitler also wanted to deal with Britain and France before Soviet Russia. So the two leaders acted expediently and agreed not to fight. Stalin started supplying wheat to Germany and also helped Germany in the attack on Poland. But Hitler was secretly planning an invasion of Russia. On June 22, 1941, the German army crashed into Soviet Russia. When Stalin was informed of this surprise attack, he fainted from fear. After regaining consciousness, he remained in a state of insanity for a week. With great difficulty, he regained self-control and addressed the Russian nation on the radio to prepare them for the enemy. The Russian people, who were earlier against Stalin, now began to regard him as a hero of their defensive war against Hitler. Overnight, he became Stalin again for the nation. The Man of Steel and the Koba Russia fought World War II under his leadership. The war claimed the lives of 250 million Russians, including Stalin's son Jacob. But Stalin's relationship with Jacob is not said to be good. He had once tried to commit suicide, so Stalin was constantly teasing him for cowardice. Jacob was an artillery officer in the Russian army when Hitler invaded Russia. On the 16th of July, 1941, he was arrested by the German army. But when Germany offered Stalin to release German prisoners in exchange for his son, Stalin vehemently refused. 2 years later, in 1943, Stalin's son Jacob died in German captivity. It is also said that he was shot by the Germans when he tried to escape. Stalin continued his war against Germany. In 1941, when the German army advanced towards the Russian capital Moscow, Stalin resisted. The troops of Stalin's Siberian army inflicted a crushing defeat on the Germans near Moscow. Stalin ordered that every Russian who could lift a gun, regardless of age, should join the Russian army. So practically all Russian citizens participated in this war. That is why this war is remembered in Russia as the Great Patriotic War. Stalin's greatest victory against the Germans was Stalingrad. The city was named after Stalin. During this war fought for Stalin, severe cold began to fall. The Russians were used to this extreme cold weather, but it was too cold for Hitler's German army, so he got into serious trouble. On February 2, 1943, nearly 90,000 German soldiers surrendered at Stalingrad. After that, the German army suffered defeat after defeat. Stalin's army also captured Berlin, the capital of Germany, in April 1945. Hitler committed suicide. Russian dictator Stalin had defeated his rival German dictator Hitler, and Soviet Russia had become the second superpower of the world under his leadership. Rather, the whole of Europe was at his mercy. At the end of World War II, Stalin had occupied all of Europe, from the Russian border to East Germany. He took more than 200 German scientists to Soviet Russia. The same scientists had developed the atomic bomb to Soviet Russia. In addition, Stalin provided arms to Mao Zedong in China. He also sent Russian fighter jets and pilots to help China and North Korea in the Korean War. But such a great dictator, this man who killed and exiled millions of people, was obviously a mere human being. On March 1, 1953, at 8 o'clock in the morning, a 73-year-old man suddenly suffered a heart attack. Doctors tried to save him for 4 days, but Stalin's heartbeat could not return to normal. The heart became weaker and weaker, and the pulse became slower and slower. He was also having trouble breathing. Stalin had died on March 5th, but his death was announced a day later. Like Lenin, Stalin's body was embalmed. Mourning was held throughout Soviet Russia for 4 days. Then on March 9th, Stalin's last rites were performed with full military honors. On this occasion, all work was stopped throughout Soviet Russia. Flights, trains, traffic, everything. In 1961, Stalin's body was exhumed from Lenin's mausoleum and buried in the famous Moscow cemetery. This is a small cemetery where many Russian leaders are buried. He was a dictator who killed millions of his own countrymen, but according to a BBC report in 2019, more than half, in other words 51% of Russian citizens, still consider Stalin a national hero.